Hello, my name is Andy Schmuckler, and I'm the host, the voice of this particular podcast, which I call Man on a Mission. But I want to get right into the lead topic for today, which is that there have been some really heartening pieces of news emerged over the course of the last week. And I think it's worth celebrating that because this has been really such a time of such ugliness. In a way, it's been growing increasingly ugly in certain ways, like American politics for a generation. But the last little while has been especially distressing. Uh, for one like me, my friends seem to feel something like this too. We really want the world to be something we can look upon with pleasure, and yearn for a world that isn't so ugly as well. Let's start with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I mean, and right away we're getting, not only is it just naked aggression by this fascist dictator in Moscow uh, with his lust for power, but we have right away we've got war crimes and then we've got uh, what's happened in Gaza uh, and Israel, with the beginnings in Israel with the atrocities that were like unspeakably brutal, cruel actions, and then the Israeli government acting without measure, without the kind of compassion. I'm very pro-Israel and very anti this fascistic regime that happens to be running Israel. Just to watch that, it's disturbing to see what's happened to the 30 plus, the deaths of 30 plus thousand Gazans, and and particularly it's disturbing if it's being done by a nation that, in my case, and I think the majority of Americans, there's basically been a positive feeling. And then we see these things going on, and suddenly, uh, in the case of Ukraine, you've got American aid package being blocked by the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party, uh, so that the Ukrainians are having to retreat for lack of ammunition, hard-won territory, rescuing Vladimir Putin, whose failure is profoundly in American national interest, not to mention the interests of most of our basic American Judeo-Christian values. So that's been pretty ugly to see. It should have been, the aid should have been flowing a half year ago, but we couldn't get it through Congress, and so and our allies, the traditional friends that have been dependent on American leadership in many world crises, are looking to the United States and finding that we're not up for the task anymore because we've got one of our houses of Congress being controlled by people who apparently would like to see Putin succeed. Who would have thought that you could ever have a Republican-controlled House of Representatives that was helping the Russians in their imperial ambitions? It's pretty ugly. And then there's the American. I mean, it's all their connections between the problem with Ukraine and what's the problem in American politics, which is one of our two major political parties is basically on the wrong side of just about everything, including particularly the leader of that party, who has shown the country exactly what he is without, there's nothing mistakable about it if you've got anything like the ability to apply average human intelligence to the publicly available evidence. And yet, the poll numbers of, I actually don't think those poll numbers should be taken that seriously. I have reason to think that the picture is for the 2024 election is a lot more positive than it looks. But even for whatever it is that leads 46% of Americans polled saying that they lean toward voting for Donald Trump after everything that we've seen. I mean, in the America I grew up in, that was it's even in this America. What the hell does that mean? It's just such an ugly thing when you grew up having some faith in the American people. I mean, what don't we know about this guy that should disqualify him for being considered for a moment by any rational person who cares about American democracy? Well, that was the picture going into this most recent week, and you know, it was such a welcome week. It was almost like watching a Hollywood movie where, the script writers are in a hurry to resolve everything. In the last 5 minutes, the girl and the guy get together, the bill gets paid, or whatever the whole set of problems is. They all get resolved in a hurry. Shakespeare's comedies end that way sometimes too. But anyway, this particular week saw some really important favorable developments. One that I don't think can be undone. The other two, I'll get to them. First, Ukraine. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, about whom we know a lot at this point, turned out not to be quite so lacking in integrity and full of hypocrisy as he seemed to be, given the role that he played in the plans for the insurrectionary attempt to overturn the 2020 election. He's been in this position, which the leadership of the House of Representatives on the Republican side have been in again and again for years now, which is why, John Boehner quit, and then who was Romney's VP candidate, Paul Ryan from Wisconsin. I mean, he also quit. It's an untenable situation where the Republicans have this ethic where they've so demonized the Democrats that no Republican is allowed to actually work in a bipartisan way with the Democrats. If you do that, you are already one of the enemy. And yet, because of the sort of the extremist wing of the Republican Party, formerly the Freedom, the Tea Party, the Freedom Caucus, whatever. Now they're called MAGA. But people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and the rest of that rogues gallery are actually able. They control the Speaker of the House because even though there would be a big majority for what the country needs to get done, you only can get that majority if you work with the Democrats. But that's a sin. And so that gives the MAGA wing control over the Speaker of the House if he's determined to hold on to his speakership. And for some reason, the Republican Party has become a place where the willingness to give up your power in order to do the right thing is vanishingly rare. I mean, we can think of Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. Those are the people who are willing to give up their seat in the House because that's what doing the right thing would bring upon them. And they did it. And they were a very, very tiny minority. Everybody else sold out. I don't think that that's indicative of politicians generally. I mean, I think that's indicative of something that's happened in a part of the country and a part of the political class. That this is not the people who are in office now as Republicans are not necessarily identical in terms of the selective process to the people who were Republicans, say, when Ronald Reagan or Gerald Ford was president. There's been an evolution and there's a moral bankruptcy that has emerged. Now, I don't fully understand exactly how that works, but I think a selective process has been operating. You know, people of principle at a certain age would have probably noticed even 30 years ago that something ugly was taking over the Republican Party, and a certain class of people would probably back away from trying to get the seat, or maybe they would lose in the primary because something was emerging in the Republican base. But however it happened, the ability to put the needs of the country and doing the right thing and important values ahead of one's own political survival and ambition is part of the what's been missing that makes this time so ugly. And the good news is that Mike Johnson appears, I mean, who knows exactly what all the motivations are, but I'm inclined to believe him when he got in front of the camera and he said, I feel that this is a moment where I've got to just do the right thing. And if Marjorie Taylor Greene wants to, whatever the verb would be, that motion to vacate, to strip him of the speakership, well, so be it. He believed the briefings that he was getting about Ukraine, and he converted in some way. And maybe the word conversion, it might be apt for this apparent self-proclaimed serious Christian. It has been so painful to watch how the Ukrainians have been left out to dry. And we should not forget that the equipping the Ukraine is something that we do not just for the Ukrainians, but for vital American national security interests. And not only are these vital interests, but the bang for the buck that we get, it's the biggest bargain I can remember watching American quest for national security for whatever it is, 60 years. I mean, this is just, a tiny fraction of our defense budget, and it has been buying so much because of what it has been doing to the chief hostile adversary of the United States, Vladimir Putin, who wishes this country nothing but ill. I wonder how do the people who support Trump not recognize that there's some important truth that's told by the fact that Vladimir Putin helped Donald Trump become president? Do they not know what an enemy of the United States he is, how eager he is to bring us down as part of restoring his own power that used to be wielded by the bipolar world of the Cold War? He thinks that the fall of the Soviet Union was one of the great tragedies of history, and he wants to win the Cold War by defeating the United States. And he wanted Donald Trump to be president. What does that tell you? Well, evidently, it's one more thing that doesn't tell a lot of people what average American intelligence should tell them. But anyway, going back to Johnson, the majority never had a chance so long as the pro-Putin wing was blocking the aid for Ukraine coming to the House floor. There's a big majority ready to vote for it, but it has to be brought to the House floor. And that's the decision of the Speaker. And for months, painful, terrible months where we're letting down Ukraine, we're frightening our allies, and we're giving up easy gains to advance some of our most important national security interests, like the peace of Europe. Not to get into a war with Putin if he swallows Ukraine and decides, well, let's start nibbling away at NATO. Wow. You want Vladimir Putin to fail. You want him to be disgraced. You want him and the whole fascist movement that's been gaining ground in this world to be discredited. And here the House of Representatives was for months coming in to rescue Vladimir Putin from his serious blunders and crimes. And then Mike Johnson said, no, let's do the right thing. And he lets this measure come to the floor, and it passes with over 300 votes. All the Democrats that voted, and almost a majority of the Republicans. I actually was a bit surprised that a slight majority of the Republicans in the House voted against it. To vote to aid Ukraine is to buck not only the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party that's in the House, it's also voting to defy Donald Trump, who, for whatever set of reasons, and I won't go into the various components that I think are part of it, he's the buddy of that human monster that's calling the shots in Russia. And Mike Johnson, who seemed to be the prisoner of the fascist force, and I've wondered, is he the prisoner of the fascist force, or is he kind of gladly part of it? I mean, I look back at what he tried to do with the bogus move to declare the certain election results uncertain, or whatever his thing was, but he was central in that process. So that sounds like, he's part of that movement that doesn't care about the rule of law, that's basically about power, and the various fascistic things that have gone along with all that. But the briefings that he got, he told the country, they've got me. I am convinced that we must do this, that this is important. And the judgment of history would be harsh if we failed to deliver to Ukraine what they need in this hour of need. I mean, those aren't his words, but that's the sense of what he communicated. And so it's been passed, and I'm talking here on Monday the 22nd. I understand that there will be the Senate will be dealing with this in a couple of days. They'll make quick work of it. This and a package of some other things too to help it to rearm Israel and to help Taiwan, and to humanitarian aid for the Palestinians in Gaza. A package that the Senate passed, but the House, for reasons I don't understand, passed in pieces, and the Senate will ratify all that, and it'll go to the president's desk. He'll sign it right away. And apparently the Pentagon's ready to get that stuff moving in a matter of just days. And so people talked about that the Ukrainians might be facing defeat. Now, there was a time when reasonable people could talk about the possibility of Ukrainians actually winning. And, things even before this, that picture looked a little less promising, because I guess the Ukrainians and the Western advisors made some misjudgments about the most recent offensive, which did not gain its purposes. But I think that there are still people who think that the Ukrainians can achieve a lot. and I don't have an opinion about that. I'm not as informed about that as I used to be, but it is definitely vital that this aid get there, and there are possibilities of really an even better outcome than saving the Ukrainians from defeat. And I'm so sad, it's so painful to watch my own government incapable of doing not only the right thing, but the obviously smart thing, wise thing, the moral thing. And here we are, and Johnson opened the path. And the will of the American people, as reflected by the majority of the House, finally could get done. And this little minority that's been calling all the shots, well, it's just part of that pattern of undermining democracy. They don't care what the majority of the House wants. They don't care what the will of the people is. They just want to exercise their power. And it is an ugly nation where people like that are able to make major decisions like whether to arm Ukraine. So I'm really glad. I was really glad to see that whole ugly picture get shifted. And I don't think it's going to cost Michael Johnson his speakership. It was a big bipartisan majority that got those things through. Which has been true of just about everything important that the House has been able to do. If you could get funding of the government to the floor, a big bipartisan majority voted for it and frustrated the desire of this fascistic fringe to shut the government down, this burn it all down group. That's what we had to do to keep the government open, is get that bipartisanship. And back earlier, there was a question of would we default or would we raise the debt ceiling? Again and again, the only way we've avoided default is for the Republican leadership to be willing to work with the Democrats and bring something to the floor that a vast majority, not including the fascist fringe, will vote for. And I'm hoping, I don't know how realistic a hope this is. I'm hoping that this breakthrough on Ukraine and the rest of this foreign aid package might represent the beginning of Johnson helping to get things done in the months that are remaining. Could this possibly happen? I don't know. But why not? Why not do it? I mean, for example, we do have a problem at the border. President Biden, in trouble with that issue, in trouble on that issue, was willing to concede a whole lot to achieve what the Republicans wanted achieved. There was a measure ready to go in both houses of Congress that would have been a big step forward. But the word came down from Donald Trump. Maybe you're informed enough to remember this incredible thing, this ugly, ugly thing. He said, don't pass this bill, even though it was a Republican conservative, let's control our borders wish list. I would rather have this issue to campaign against Biden on, which means a dishonest campaign because Biden was willing to do this. But Trump never worried about a dishonest campaign. Or that rather than solve the problem, I want this problem that I can use as a weapon against Joe Biden in the election. I mean, if you knew nothing else about that candidate other than he told his minions, block this thing so I can run on it rather than solve the problem, you would know a lot. You would know enough to know this is not a guy to give the powers of the presidency to. He's not there to serve the American people. Of course, we know that from a whole lot of other things. But would Michael Johnson be willing to bring that to the floor? And if he did, would there be a big bipartisan majority? I think that there would. If he could make a deal with the Democrats, and if there are enough Republicans that support getting certain things done that the majority would actually like to get done, he could be immune to being kicked out of the speakership by this fringe. I mean, if you need to get to 218 votes, and it's only going to be Republican votes, you need all the Republicans. I think you can give up one or two at this point. Such a narrow. The fact that they had such a narrow victory out of 2022 condemned the speakership to be extremely fragile, particularly if they pass a stupid rule that allows one person to call the speaker into question. But we could have a bargain, maybe, that would let the American government look like a functioning body in the way that historically it usually has been, where you can get something done because it is the will of the people and the people's representatives, and it's good for the country. So it was at least a start, and Ukraine gets the weapons. So it's good it's good news in terms of what's going to be happening between Russia and Ukraine, on which a whole lot hinges, including what the order of Europe will be like. That we've gone into 2 world wars and a Cold War over in the last century plus. But it's also good news in terms of the American political scene, where the guy who, after the vice president, is in line to become president, a guy who controls the House of Representatives in a way that's really pretty powerful. I don't think anybody in the Senate has nearly the power over that body that the Speaker of the House has. That he may have undergone a kind of conversion experience, which might be confined to this aid package, but it might be more general. I mean, what's he got to gain by continuing to have a dysfunctional House with the election half a year off? I think the Democrats are going to take control of the House. I think all the special elections we've seen, and if he stays wedded to the people that make the House dysfunctional, how likely is he to be Speaker come next January anyway? Anyway, that's how I look at it. Hopeful, good things already, some more hopeful things on the horizon. So let's go to the second bit of good news, which has got to do with the Middle East. Last week, on Sunday, Saturday night, but it was Sunday already in Israel, the 14th, that all these cruise drones and missiles were unleashed by Iran from a variety of locations. I thought they were all coming from Iran for a while, but no, apparently they were launching it from different directions, including from mainland Iran, to attack Israel. And some people, like General McCafferty, who's a military general, obviously military, is on MSNBC saying this is a disproportionate response. And when I hear that, I think, here we go. I had already been talking about the implications of what Israel had done, that the Iranians were launching this attack in retaliation to. The Israelis attacked what I guess would legally be considered part of the Iranian embassy in Damascus. I believe it's obvious to anybody who is considering, should we do this or should we not do this? I think it was obvious to the Israeli decision makers that this represented a major escalation and provocation, because legally that's Iranian territory. So to attack an embassy is to attack the sovereign territory of the nation whose embassy it is. And it's a no-no. The international order that's been set up over, and I don't know how far back it goes, I think probably at least to the 17th century, the diplomatic immunity and respect for territoriality. If you watch Law and Order, if there's somebody connected with the embassy involved in a crime, the New York police can't touch them. Like that. So I figure the Israelis are making a decision when they go after this embassy to invite a wider regional war. And I worried about that. I also wondered, well, why would they want to do that? And I had thoughts about that, but we should identify that the wider regional war is something that the Biden administration, well, let's just say the United States, has been super eager to avoid from the very beginning, from the first provocations of the atrocities of October 7th. Right away, Biden sends some ships to the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and everybody said, and I think he puts it actually in anybody thinking about expanding this conflict, that the Hamas attack was engendering, don't. That was an American priority from the very beginning. And here are the Israelis apparently knowingly inviting the transformation of this slow boil regional war into something that could be really big, where the Israelis, for example, would be attacking the Iranian nuclear program and their oil refineries and whatever the major targets are on their list for the things that they've gamed out. And the Iranians would perhaps be unleashing Hezbollah. It's got 150,000 missiles. I mean, what would that be like? I mean, just to look at it in the most crass terms, I think you would have the price of oil. And we went through this twice in the 70s when there's war in that area. The hostage crisis of 79 and the Yom Kippur War in 73, the prices of oil quadrupled. And the world's economy had the kind of reaction to that you would expect. Even just considering Biden's political interest, which, by the way, I fervently believe is the interest of preserving American democracy in this particular election. His interest was not to have that size of a war. But the Iranian response, if it was disproportionate, really seemed to invite a further escalation that I was imagining that the Israelis had in mind when they first attacked the embassy. If the Israelis wanted that, the Iranians, if I believe McCafferty, were giving them, opening the door for the Israelis to retaliate in a way that would keep the escalation going till we got to that war that the Americans and the whole world really don't need. That was part of the ugliness of that moment. And I was worried at the beginning of the week. And I think that Biden, well, I've been very critical of Biden about his not distancing himself more from this Netanyahu government, more and using our leverage more on him, because Netanyahu and his fascistic gang have completely disregarded everything he said about how they should proceed and how they should not proceed. well, not. I mean, I'm a little bit overstated, but basically, they took the weapons and they ignored the advice. But he responded right away, and he said, and he did everything he could, short of using that, making the weapons conditional, to encourage the Israelis. Take the win, he said, and the win was. And this was a significant piece of the picture, too. I don't know how much it's played into this good news of this week, but the Iranians attacked with over 300 explosive airborne weapons. There must be a better way of articulating that. And 99% of them, plus, were destroyed en route by Israeli missile defenses and air defenses of other kinds, but also with the help of the United States, and it was a couple of regional powers, Jordan and Saudi Arabia. So take the win meant the Iranians threw a whole lot at you, and you just wiped them off the board. That they didn't lay a glove on you, and that is a victory of sorts. It's not the ability to defend is a victory when you're dealing with a country like Iran and you're Israel, and Iran has been saying Israel should be wiped off the map, and has been for years assiduously building proxy means of attacking Israel from a variety of directions, getting a foothold in Syria, pretty much taking over with Hezbollah, Lebanon, and arming them with serious weapons that can seriously threaten Israel. The Israelis proved something about themselves that made them look not like a victim, but like somebody who has such defenses that the Iranians were barely touched them. One Bedouin girl was seriously wounded, the only casualty. Over 99%. So Biden tells the Israelis to take the win. And we hear that the Israelis are thinking about what to do. And it turns out that there was indeed in the Israeli government, from the people that you would expect, the Jewish nationalists, the people who treat the Palestinians like, like they're into ethnic cleansing, basically, and really don't deal from compassion and mutual respect, or do unto others as they would have others do unto them, which is what Rabbi Hillel said 200 years before Jesus did. That group wanted massive retaliation, and the world was wondering what they were going to do. But what happened this past week was that the Israelis made a decision about how they were going to retaliate. I mean, they said right away that they were going to retaliate. So the idea of not retaliating was excluded from the beginning. And then when the Israelis did what they did, the Iranians also made a decision about how they were going to respond. And in both cases, it was de-escalation. And we've gotten out of that spiral. The Israelis confine themselves, as it is interpreted, as sending a message in a not damaging way of saying, we can get to you. They in the general area of where the nuclear program is headquartered or something, Isfahan. Some things detonated on Iranian territory. No biggie. And then the Iranians, they acted almost like nothing had happened. So we're out of that escalatory thing. And why the Israelis? Was it Biden's encouragement? Was it because there really was a victory? The good news there goes beyond the idea that we don't have the regional war that it looked like we might well be heading for. There's also been a potential, or at least a real, at least temporary, maybe not temporary, restoration of Israel's place, its proper place in the wider world. The way this Netanyahu government has behaved in their response to the Hamas atrocities has been very ugly and very, very foolish. It was a crime with respect to the Palestinians, a crime of the sort that fascists tend to commit. And it was a blunder for the Israelis, which of a kind that the fascists also tend to do, because you take a look at Berlin in 1945. Fascism does not lead to great success. And look at the Russia that we're going to have now that we got the aid going back to Ukraine, and maybe they'll even be stronger than they were. We've got the reputational damage to Israel throughout the world, including in the United States, where we're backing Netanyahu so unconditionally, has cost Biden, at least temporarily, some young people and Arab Americans and stuff like that. And I think needlessly. I think it could have been played differently. But politics is difficult. I don't want to pretend to know what I don't. But I think you could have. So we've got the Israelis pounding away at Gaza. The only way you can get to Hamas, Hamas set a trap for them, but you don't have to jump into the trap that your enemies set. You can apply a little bit of creativity, or as you would say in Yiddish, a little zachel, and you come up with a different way of responding to this thing to actually defeat Hamas's purposes, which the Israeli actions were so ugly, they helped to actually advance the probability that eventually the Jewish state wouldn't exist, because they lost support in the West. And because the whole progress that was being made in the Arab region of integrating Israel into the region on a cooperative basis, like the Abraham Accords, that for some reason the Trump, the one achievement in the foreign policy that the Trump people can claim credit for, relations with three or four Arab countries being normalized, expanding beyond the Egypt and Jordan, and adding some Gulf states, and even all the way out to Morocco, and being en route before October 7th, the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia engaged in a process which looked like it was leading to what people say, and I don't understand why that was going to be such a big deal, but people say that the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia would be a major breakthrough in terms of integrating Israel into the wider region, which is something that the Israelis have been wanting since 1948. But as soon as this Hamas-Israel war got off the ground, that was blown off the table, and countries that had already recognized Israel were sort of backing away because their publics were furious with what Israel was doing to the Palestinians. Understandably, I have to say. So Israel, under this group, has made itself into an international pariah. And I was worried that and I still am, that this damage to Israel in terms of its place in the world might last for a generation. And since I just turned 78 a few days ago, I can predict with a certain amount of certainty that if it takes a generation, I'll never see Israel having any good standing in the world again. And that was my concern. I mean, it takes a while to live down certain things. I mean, how long did it take the Germans? I mean, they're the long case. It took a while, and I think that it's going. I wrote early in the Ukraine invasion that what Putin was doing to the reputation of Russia in the world, would take a generation or more to repair. But something has happened, and I didn't see it, but I read a piece by David Ignatius in the Washington Post that sort of laid it out. And I think that I understand that it's valid and how it works. This is the picture. When Iran attacked Israel, the focus of the region shifted from here's this ugly stuff going on in Gaza to here's a confrontation between Israel, this little but mighty power, and Iran, this rather major and troublemaking power that's on the threshold of having nuclear weapons. And it's troublemaking in a variety of ways that are of concern to the wider world. Their nuclear program has certainly got the United States attention, and that's why Obama worked so hard, John Kerry and all, to get that agreement that Trump blew up. And Iran is also aligned with Russia, with Putin. Those drones that the Russians are using to attack civilians in Ukraine, they're being supplied by the Iranians, and the Iranians, I guess, helped them build a factory to make Iranian-style drones there. This is a new version of the axis of evil that Ronald Reagan once talked about. And by evil, I mean they're the people who upset the possibilities of peace. With Russia doing it there, and the Iranians, whose role in the Middle East has been very destabilizing, is a revolutionary regime that came in with the Ayatollahs, not with a live and let live attitude, but with the fascistic attitude of we're going to make trouble enough so that we can dominate. And they've been pretty successful in extending their power since they overthrew the Shah in 78, 79 and installed this revolutionary regime. I mean, they were the big beneficiaries of America's blunder into Iraq, so that the Iranians really dominate Iraq now. They are, along with the Russians, pretty much the muscle that kept the Assad regime in power in Syria. And they've got a big say there, which is why the Israelis are continually attacking Iranian targets in Syria. That was not new. The embassy aspect of it was the escalation. But attacking Iranian targets has been going on for years. And they basically, they have a big influence over Hezbollah. I don't know how big. And Hezbollah is pretty almost more powerful than the Lebanese government. And they have the power to make war or not make war from southern Lebanon against Israel. And they do it sometimes, including during this Gaza thing. So the Iranians are kind of the force of fascism in its aggressiveness, along with Putin being a force of fascism in their aggressiveness. And they're also a force of oppression, which we know how oppressive Putin's regime is in Russia. And his ally in Iran is fascistically oppressive too, as we saw when that 22-year-old woman was what was she, beaten to death by the authorities because she didn't, the moral police that go around looking for women who don't keep their hair covered well enough, according to this kind of inquisition-spirited thing that we also see in the United States in our version of the force of fascism. So the Iranian people are chafing under this oppressive regime. So there's this bigger thing than what's going on in Gaza. If we're looking at Gaza, which is important, but it's not the same thing in terms of how do the Saudi Arabians or the Jordanians or the rest of the Sunni Arab world that the Shia Ayatollahs are basically threatening since they came to power. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is an old saying. And so this shift of the focus from the level of Gaza to the level of Iran showed that Israel is actually not so terribly isolated when people are thinking about the bigger threat that concerns them, which is Iran, or in the case of the Western allies, Iran and their allies in Moscow. So David Ignatius talked about how certain Arab nations participated in the defeat of the Iranian air attack on Israel. And Israel is part of a coalition of the forces opposed to Iran, which means it is valuable to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, and to other Arab countries too, I imagine, for being a force that can keep the Iranians in check. So I don't think I've done quite justice to all that Ignatius described, but there was I had a feeling of it won't necessarily take a generation for people to readjust their view of Israel. Unfortunately, we still got that same fascistic group, that Jewish nationalist outfit calling the shots in Israel. Don't know how quickly we can get to elections so that maybe a better government. And I don't feel sure that this particular good news, no regional war, that's going to stay. Israel shifting the focus to the wider picture in which they play a role as part of a respectable and important alliance or coalition or team. I don't feel confident that this will be territory that we can hold on to. What it depends on is what the Israeli government does next with respect to Gaza. I think that this is an opportunity, if they were wise, to declare victory in some way. And it's not like what Senator Aiken said in the late 60s about Vietnam, that we should declare victory when there was no victory and then bring our troops home. No, I think that the Israelis actually do have some victory that they can declare. They haven't destroyed Hamas altogether. But this is not a moment to get the world to look again at a new batch of Israeli ugliness going after Hamas and killing lots of Palestinians. I don't trust this outfit to make the smart decision because he didn't make the smart decision before. And I don't mean to suggest that the Israelis were put in a position where it was obvious what the optimal, but it is obvious to me that the course that the Netanyahu gang has put Israel on, since after a few weeks after the atrocities, when they started doing what they decided to do, I don't feel uncertain about whether that was a blunder and contrary to their interests. So that's the second piece of good news, which I hope the Israelis can take the win and use the second chance to reestablish themselves in the world as something that's not so ugly. And maybe proceed with a political process that will put some of the better angels that are quite powerful in the Israeli nation in control of the nation's destiny. I mean, we Americans have just recently gone through the experience where our behavior in the world was ugly. And not because that's how we as a nation wanted to be. I mean, when you see Donald Trump push the president of Montenegro aside at a NATO conference, like rude and an American president behaving like that, ashamed. We know what it's like to have the wrong outfit in charge. So if the Israelis can avoid bringing the focus back to Gaza for at least a little while and get a new government in, the damage might be largely undone. And Israel might once again be able to sort of build itself into a better form in which the rights of the Palestinians are given the proper weight, even if the situation is enormously challenging, which it always has been and will be for as far as the eye can see. Nonetheless, however challenging, there are stupid ways of dealing with things and destructive ways of dealing with things. And then there's the best ways available given the conditions. The Israelis haven't been doing that since Netanyahu came to power, and probably before that. So that's two bits of really good news in the world that delight me. And then there's Trump and his trial. I mean, here the issue is basically, is America going to protect and preserve its democracy and in the rule of law, or will they be defeated by a force of fascism that has quite visibly taken control of one of America's two major political parties? And that basic question has a variety of showdowns, but none more urgent than the upcoming election in November. And how that's going to go depends on how are the American people going to understand? How are they going to perceive their choices? I think that the most essential way of perceiving the choices is democracy versus fascism. I mean, that's the heart of the issue. And in one case, the force of fascism is represented by a particular man who's been telling us what he's going to do if he gets elected. And it's a very recognizable pattern that we've seen in fascist countries over the last century. It's not hidden anymore. And the question is, how many people are going to see that what it is that he represents, or will see him as being something that they do not want to see in the presidency again. Let's put it that way. That's more general, because in this case of this trial, there have been uncertainties, and I have been very uncertain. What's the impact of this trial going to be on how Americans see things? I mean, there are people who say it's all been baked into the cake. Everybody knows about Stormy Daniels. Uh, Everybody knows about the payoffs. And maybe not everybody knows about David Pecker and the National Enquirer, but in any event, we've seen the Access Hollywood video however many times. It, this is not the trial we wanted to have go first. I mean, the January 6th trial at the Supreme Court is corruptly postponed, so it's almost it's very unlikely that the American people will get to see that trial before they have to vote. That's the one where there was really, really big things that went on that can be shown and that are really important. But this, what people call the hush money trial, people, even some people who are, let's just say, sympathetic with the importance of understanding that Donald Trump is a criminal, acts like a criminal, that there are good reasons why he's under, at this point, 88 criminal indictments that have been handed down and that documented in ways that show, yeah, they really got the goods on this guy on these charges, the RICO charges in Georgia, the January 6th insurrectionary coup charges, the document Espionage Act charges down in Florida. You can see that this is all true. But this is a complicated case. You got to prove that the falsification of the New York business records, which is just a misdemeanor, I guess, unless it's to cover up another crime. And so it's got a little complexity to it. How many people are going to understand it? Well, I think that this week we saw something. And here, this is my interpretation more than the other things. It's more speculative on my part. What I think that I saw is that this trial actually is going to be very damaging to Donald Trump, which makes it valuable because getting more Americans to see that he's not the guy you want to give the powers of the presidency to when you go into the ballot box. He's dangerous. He's not the right kind of guy. There's something wrong with this guy. I don't know how many Americans are going to see the fascism and the threat to democracy and the rule of law. But at more primitive levels, I think I sense that there's something coming here. First of all, and I don't remember that I saw any particular new evidence in this week, I think that the picture of Trump as a cheater will come through. And I'm hoping that that I'm not atypical of other Americans, that I don't like cheaters. But I don't. There's a lot of things that Trump is that he doesn't hide, and yet there are a lot of people who seem to think that, oh yeah, let's make this guy president. So, but there's another level that did get exposed this first week, which is that Trump was put in a position that seemed to be hard for him to cope with. He was in a situation where he was not in control. And it's really a little bit bizarre how difficult it is for Donald Trump to control himself. there was a lack of self-control. It's a defiance, but it's a defiance that is not a reflection of strength in a way, which I think that a lot of his fans think he's being strong because he's so rebellious. There's a he can't help himself aspect to it. So I'll be interested to see what Judge Engeron does um, tomorrow about the gag order violations. Uh, I mean, the evidence is mixed about whether Trump is capable of consistent. I mean, he does control himself. He's had some days where a gag order has, but he continually steps up to the line and then crosses it, or arguably crosses it. He can't stop being defiant, which, I mean, people say that the judges are afraid to throw him in jail, but if he finds him, which is I guess what people who know more than I do about these things, people expect that the Engeron is going to fine him for each of these N accounts $1,000, but everybody knows that doesn't matter to. Uh, but if Trump is sort of out of control, I mean, he got found by a jury to have defamed what's her name, E. Jean Carroll, and they impose a penalty of $5 million. He continues to defy. Apparently, it's very unusual in that situation that any defendant who's already been, paid a price and been found guilty of sexual assault and of defaming would go right out and do it some more. But that's what Trump did. And the result was that the jury, seeing this, took this $5 million penalty and boosted it up to by another 80 some million dollars. There's a defective quality in the man that the jury is responding to. And what Trump showed in court in the last week was kind of ugly and showed his weaknesses. What people have thought was his powerful and commanding ways start to look like the incapacity of a defective man. Pictures in terms of weakness, pictures of him, or the word pictures of him falling asleep, I guess repeatedly in the court. And I gather there's this story floating around the background. I think I think it's not apocryphal that when he was asleep, he was emitting foul-smelling gases that were a problem for his attorneys to cope with. And he was behaving in ways that got the judge to admonish him, sit down. I will not tolerate any further intimidation of witnesses. Is that clear? I mean, there's a way in which he's being compelled to subordinate himself to certain requirements of conduct. And he can't do it. And he behaves in ways, he's muttering, he's doing this, he's pointing, and he's passing notes, and he's glowering. And the jury's going to be looking at this. Now, I wish that the whole country could be looking at these trials. I think that the public interest in seeing what the jury sees would be very great. And we're not going to see that. But I think that enough is going to come out that isn't necessarily at the level of he violated the law, though there will be that stuff too. But there will be something at the more visceral human level that Donald Trump, who's got a genius about self-presentation, coming down the escalator, the beginning of his campaign, hovering over Hillary. What a powerful, bad dude he is. I think that this trial may be difficult for Trump to cope with, and that the American people will get to see him in a different way. And I confess not to really fully understanding why the people who find his presentation appealing, what it is that they like. But I suspect that what we're going to be seeing and what we saw last week will erode that image of himself that he's used to become this Übermensch, the successful entrepreneur. I mean, he's being unmasked in a variety of ways, but maybe people who have been impervious to seeing that as a big business success, he's been basically just a fraud with all the bankruptcies and all the fraudulent thises and that's. He's a con man. Well, people who haven't seen that, maybe when it comes to seeing a guy that can't control himself and is so wounded at the level of compliance with authority, it acts in ugly ways whenever authority has power over him. Breaking the laws that he's broken is part of that defiance, but at a more primitive level. I think he's going to be offering us something of a window. At least he did this last week, into the human monster that his unfortunate upbringing turned him into, who cannot accept any position except for dominating. Would you want this kind of guy to be wielding the powers of the presidency? That's what people maybe will be asking themselves when they go to vote in November. If they've been revolted by his behavior, the way it seems like the jury was in the E. Jean Carroll case, I think more people will answer no, and that's why I regard it as good news that Donald Trump has done what he's done, and this trial may be more promising than people have thought. Okay. That was this was a week of several very promising developments in America and globally. Let me just show some of the other topics that, let's see, I want to turn on this topic. And tell a personal story of my discovering and fighting the rising force of fascism. It's been an adventure, and I think sufficiently interesting that telling my personal process will be illuminating of some of the big things that are true about this political world that we've found ourselves in America. That's led, for example, to our having to deal with Donald Trump as a president and a presidential candidate now, and with a political party that's pretty much been completely dominated by this fascistic, extremely defective human being. I'll start the story in 1990. I lived inside the Washington Beltway. Um, I was, as I still am, married to the lady in that picture. Uh, and her 20th high school reunion came up in 1990. 1990 was the 20th class of 70, and her high school was down in Jacksonville, Florida. And I'd never been south in Dixie, south of North Carolina. And we drove with kids from Washington, D.C. down to attend the reunion of Nathan Bedford Forrest High School in Jacksonville. Now, he's a guy who was guilty of war crimes, a founder of the Ku Klux Klan, and Ken Burns called him one of the two geniuses in the Civil War. So he was very capable, and he was as ugly a figure in terms of the spirit of the Confederacy as there was. And they named a high school after him. Anyway, I'd never been, we were driving through South Carolina. It was the first time in South Carolina. And I turned on the car radio and I heard this voice that I'd never heard before. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was, turned out to be Rush Limbaugh. But at that point, I thought I was listening to some radio station. And I thought, oh my gosh, I knew that South Carolina was the hotbed of secessionism. And it's very far to the right. And but this stuff sounds, like talking about feminazis and eco-fascism and, basically demonizing the other side, liberals, this and that. Oh my gosh, I thought, wow. So South Carolina is still that way. Anyway, so I drove on, attended the reunion, came back to Washington. And then I discovered this wasn't a South Carolina radio station. This was a guy on the way to becoming the Godzilla of talk radio. He was soon going to be described as having 20 million ditto heads. And if you'd asked me, like in 1990, what radio station would you say is the most family friendly, sort of like the station in the Twin Cities in Minnesota I grew up with, WCCO? It was like a community station. You just sort of felt all the good warm vibes of it, and you felt this is a wonderful community of people who are listening to this station, who care about the things that people are supposed to care about. WMAL in Washington was that kind of a station, and all of a sudden, their radio, their afternoon programming was going to include 3 hours of Rush Limbaugh, the guy who talked about feminazis and eco-fascism. I got really, really concerned. Why is a voice like this rising to pervade so much of the American body politic? I mean, this is toxic stuff. But then I moved out to the western flank of the Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, living among some of the 20 million ditto heads. And I just published a book called a critique of the market economy and how it's necessary to correct for the blind spots that are built into the logic of that system. I still think that it shows something important about how it is essential that economic forces not just unfold according to their own logic, but that their blind spots be corrected so that we don't get driven to become a different kind of society than we want. Anyway, I hadn't thought that I was going to promote the book on the local radio station. And from my point of view, I was sort of moving. I was moving out to live so I could see what I'm seeing when I look out this window. This beautiful forest and the ridge on Great North Mountain, 2 miles to my west, along which the crest of which runs the West Virginia boundary. This is what I moved out here for. I hadn't even thought about being part of a wider community. But I had been thinking about the toxicity that Rush Limbaugh was putting into the American body politic, and I thought, well, let me go out there into Radioville here, and I'm not going to be the Godzilla of talk radio, but maybe I can find myself some kind of a niche, and so I promoted myself to the host of a show where something like, I got 2 hours to talk about my book that had just come out from SUNY Press, State University of New York, and I dealt with callers who called in because the right wing doesn't like the idea that there's a place for government to exercise wise regulation of market forces in order to protect various public interests. So I got some of those right-wing calls, and at the end of the show, the host was happy enough with what that 2-hour program had been that he invited me to come back, and that was a beginning of a very important chapter in my life where I got to talk with conservative callers. I continue to be a regular guest twice a month on that show. And after 5 years of doing that, I got my own show that I had on the weekend where I could talk to people. And what I was interested in doing wasn't fighting against the right wing. When I got my own show, I said that the newspaper article about me was that I wanted to be the not Rush Limbaugh show, but not in the sense of being a liberal version, but in the sense of being an honest conversation rather than the kind that he fostered, not catering to people's prejudices and resentments, not demonizing enemies, not cultivating and bringing out the worst in people, but trying to build bridges, trying to have conversation with mutual respect to see if we can find common ground. And, bridge building was what I was interested in doing. Because I watched the politics of that time, that whole decade, and I saw a lot of polarization taking place. Let me get back to the picture. Will that do it? Oh, I wish I were more competent at these things. No. Sorry about that. Clayton, if you're listening, could you save me from myself, please? I seem to be having trouble getting back to the full screen. Maybe this is it. No, that's... Okay, well, I'm just going to... That really makes no sense to do that. I've done this before. Okay. Oh, that's what's missing. Well, here I am. Forgive my incompetence, please. So, going back to the 1990s, on every issue, I saw the country in the process of polarization. Um, there always were differences between the Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. But as time was going along, uh, people were moving further and further away from any common ground they might have into positions that were more and more mutually exclusive. I didn't do that, so maybe Clayton's rescuing me from. And then I wrote a piece. I can't remember if it appeared in the Baltimore Sun or on the Christian Science Monitor. And it articulates my understanding of the nature of our divisions at that time. It did not represent what I eventually came to understand was happening, which was that there were people who were intentionally dividing us. But this was based on where I was coming from at the time, which was uh, really into building bridges with people on the assumption that they were all acting on the basis of good faith. For those of us who feel ourselves to be participants in America's present culture war, it is difficult to understand the conflict other than as a battle between an us who are right and a them who are wrong. Whether the issue is law and order, the expression of human sexuality, the balance between rights and responsibilities, or any of today's other charged and divisive issues, we see ourselves as embodying wisdom and virtue, and our opponents as misguided and possibly even evil. This view of our cultural polarization leads naturally to a view of how the conflict should be resolved by the victory of our side in the arenas of persuasion and political power. Pat Buchanan, for example, has used military images of fighting house by house, street by street, to take our culture back. Progressives on the left are calling for mobilization to block the advancing forces of the Christian coalition. For the combatants, the culture war is about division. But let's look at the polarized sides as components of a cultural whole and inquire how polarization occurs in human systems and what a better alternative might be. Polarization is something that we can see happening constantly in human relationships on scales large and small. I have observed some relatively benign examples in my own life. When I drive with my mother, who can envision accidents occurring at every turn, she voices the need for caution to a degree I regard as extreme. In response, an impulse arises in me to drive less carefully than I usually do. In the presence of what I see as my mother's overcautiousness, I have to work to maintain my more typical prudence. This dynamic leads to a division of labor concerning the polarity of caution and daring. Something analogous happens between me and my 18-year-old son. This was written in the 1990s, by the way, again, mid-90s. To my mind, he procrastinates too much. I lean on him to take care of business more promptly and reliably. His tendency toward procrastination may have developed in reaction to my own tighter relationship with my inner taskmaster. But whatever its origin, when I am in his presence, I tend to become even more like myself than usual. My taking care of business muscles get tighter than even I am comfortable with. You have probably noticed how married couples can polarize in various ways. between the slob and the compulsive straightener, the spendthrift and the miser, the one who does all the feeling and the one who is always rational and controlled, etc. When people divide on any issue, unless they find a resolution, they tend to push each other further out toward the opposite ends of the spectrum. Each represents a value that is legitimate, but that also must be balanced against another value. Polarization is one way the system preserves balance, but it is an unstable and conflictual balance. Far better if the actors in the system, instead of dividing into mirror image opposites of one another, could achieve the healthier balance of integration. But such integration is difficult. It represents that high human achievement, wisdom. In the absence of wisdom, people are compelled to struggle in their folly. Each side, wedded to its half-truth, sees the other as the problem. But the problem is a property of the system. The polarization and conflict are simple symptoms of the failure to find a way to bring together into a whole those values that are in tension. The polarization of our culture around a variety of hot-button issues, such as whether or not to prohibit the burning of the American flag, to stigmatize the birth of children to unmarried women, to teach the canon of the Western tradition, to execute criminals, to accept homosexuality, to allow religion into our public institutions, represents a failure to integrate a deeper polarity that has always been at the heart of the American experiment. On the one hand, we cherish the value of the free flowering of the human spirit. On the other hand, we also honor the value of a coherent social order. The present battle between the defenders of the traditional social order and the advocates of more countercultural values of liberty is a message to us of a challenge yet unmet by our present civilization. To find an integration at a higher level of human wisdom than either side of that war has yet achieved. The idea that the truth lies between the extreme would be a cliche. The cliche it appears to be, if it meant only the need for some mechanical compromise, a splitting of the difference. But the real truth lies not in between, but above the extremes. The great spiritual leaders of humankind, a Buddha or a Jesus or a Gandhi or a St. Francis or a Dalai Lama, took values that seemed to be in tension and integrated them into a form that is not just compromise or a lowest common denominator. At their level of integration, one might be at once freer than the libertines and more disciplined than the straight-laced. One might be both a better warrior than the hawks and a better peacemaker than the doves. The best resolution of our culture is not to be found through our present mode of conflict. Neither is it to be found in mere centrist political compromise. The real challenge is for both sides to work together toward an integration at that higher level, where the opposites no longer seem so irrevocably opposed, where the expression of our liberty and the requirements of our civilized order achieve a fuller harmony. No easy task. But the more quickly we can move out of our stance as partisan combatants into a position from which we can see how we are in this dance of polarization together, the sooner we can get to the real work. You know, I still think all of that is true and valid and even important. but it missed something essential about what was happening in America at that time, which I didn't recognize until, let's see, certainly by 2004. I had thought, and on my radio shows talking to the conservatives, we actually were engaged in that kind of bridge building. And the people I was talking to were coming from a position of good faith. But over time, the propagandists of the right, who were not just a part of some kind of cultural polarization, but were actively working to create it, people like Rush Limbaugh, were transforming the minds of their followers into something where even if they called me to talk from a position of their own good faith, what they were being taught was true was being given to them by propagandists working in bad faith. First Rush Limbaugh, and then Newt Gingrich, who's learning some lessons from the Nazi propagandist Goebbels, is, I think, established as a fact. And then Fox News and Rupert Murdoch. The force of fascism has a strong interest in dividing the people against each other. They nullify each other by being divided, which means that the will of the people who are preoccupied with the things that divide them and are engaged in bad-tempered fights with each other as demonized, can't cooperate to achieve their common purposes, and that opens the door to the few who seek power in some more fascistic, less democratic order. I didn't see that in the 90s. Part of my work, besides on the radio during that era, well, first of all, I wrote a couple of books, Debating the Good Society, A Quest to Bridge America's Moral Divide, came out in 1999 from MIT Press. And it was an attempt to create a bunch of characters and to create the conversation that I thought would lead to the kind of integration and higher wisdom that I thought we should be striving toward. And I also used those platforms that I had established during my public life in ethical societies in the country, and a variety of Unitarian pulpits or platforms or something where I would occasionally present myself as having something to say and be invited to give a sermon. I called the message then Beyond Dispute, meaning that we should instead of waging war, we should be engaged in building bridges. All that was predicated on good faith. But then as the force of fascism with its bad faith was taking over conservative America, I changed my tune. I changed how I understood it. I saw that I couldn't talk to these people who were presenting, how do you talk to people, for example, about how Obama is not really qualified to be president because he was born in Kenya. I mean, the premise was so flawed. You couldn't get to the level where it's worth talking to each other about. The foundation was faulty. Nothing could be built on it. And so I stopped doing radio, except not call-in radio anyway. And then in 2004, and I've written about this and done other videos about the strange moment where I saw, in some way that I don't understand, I saw the ugliness of the force taking over the Republican Party, and then I felt compelled to understand what it was I had seen, and worked for 20 years now to develop this picture of how these kinds of forces work. And I, when the election of 2004 was held in November, which was about 2 months after I had seen this sort of life-changing picture of a threatening thing taking over the political right in an administration that I continue to try to understand better, because W seems like a different guy as a post-presidential human being than he did when he was surrounding himself with Karl Rove to function as his brain, and Dick Cheney, he chose to be his vice president. Anyway, there was something going on there. I was definitely deeply concerned about the damage that was going to be done to our world if W got a second term. He'd already launched the war in Iraq, which was damaging at so many levels. So when he won that election, it was a very close election. I mean, as Ohio went, so the presidency went. And I saw great dangers. And I also saw that there was a position to be played by a certain kind of voice to countervail what was going to be manifesting from the White House. And I felt it was really important that the right American voice step up to the microphones and deliver. And I had thought through some of what the campaign had to look like at the campaign after the campaign in order to get the American people to put a check on some of the damage that was going to soon be done. As it happened, I had access to John Kerry, who he had been the champion of the alternative to a second term for W, which was, I thought, extremely dangerous for him to get. And I didn't have direct contact with Kerry, but I did have a good entryway to somebody who was right next to Kerry, so that the possibilities of communication existed. And I quickly utilized the channel that I had and articulated as best I was able. There's a role here for Mr. Kerry, Senator Kerry. Here's why it needs to be played. Here's how he can play it. These are the opening moves. And I also volunteer myself to be of any assistance that I can. And I don't require being paid if he wants to utilize me in any way. Something like that. Utilizing contacts, which are, I've generally been a pretty isolated figure, but with assorted occasional ways onto the close to center stage. I work hard on any such communication, so I don't remember. I'm sure I couldn't find it on any of my hard drives, but I worked hard at it, and I got it to Kerry through that contact. And then word came back to me that Senator Kerry thanks me for the proposal, but he's just too exhausted. And I hadn't campaigned at that time, but a guy running for president, I guess he wasn't all that old, and I don't think he was 60 yet. 2004. No, he probably would have been about 60. I was 58. But it is very demanding, and running for president, all that air travel, it really takes a lot. Anyway, he declined. He was polite, appreciated, but I'd failed to recruit what I thought was the best voice in the country to step up, because at that moment, I mean, it was a moment that would be lost in a matter of months when he just became the guy who lost the election. At that moment, he was the champion of the other side. So then I thought, what would be who else could play this role? Somebody who has stature on the American stage that people recognize as being a person of integrity, who has shown already that he is sensitive to the values that are at stake in this rising force of fascism that this W presidency represented, that differentiated itself from his father's presidency and from any other presidency that there had been in our lifetime, maybe in American history. I really think that people have forgotten just how destructive the W presidency was. Interesting how people forget things. Really interesting. But it was really quite clear to me that this was a very dangerous presidency. And this was, the presidency that gave us torture from the highest levels and gave us the torture memo, which basically says the president will be above the law. Very dangerous. And there was a guy who came to me that was, I thought, had the stature, had the sensitivities to the values at stake, and even had the ability to summon up the spiritual level of things, which I have always thought is where the rubber fundamentally hits the road. And that was Bill Moyers. Now, I had some standing with Bill Moyers, much more standing with Bill Moyers than I had with John Kerry, who didn't know me from Adam. I just had an entryway into his inner circle. But Moyers, when that book there, The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power in Social Evolution, came out in 1984, that was the University of California Press. My publisher told me that Bill Moyers had expressed great interest in that book and asked for a copy of it, and indicated some interest in maybe interviewing me, but that didn't happen in 1984-85-86. But I knew that he was interested. And then I came out with another book. Let's see if I can be a little less clumsy here. Let's see. Why isn't that going? Oh, wrong thing. In 1988, I had published this book, Out of Weakness, Healing the Wounds That Drive Us to War, which was a sequel at a more psychological and spiritual level to the systemic issues that I illuminated in that first book. Which is, just so you can see, that. So I learned that he was interested in this book when I got a call that to come up to New York. This is, I think, 1991, where he, Bill Moyers, and Elie Wiesel were creating a documentary called Beyond Hate. And my book about healing the wounds that drive us to war fit into that enough that they thought that interviewing me, like I said, I've been pretty much of a nobody off to myself in the oblivion most of the time. But every once in a while, there will be an opportunity. And I didn't hesitate to go up to New York, where I sat in front of the camera and had a long conversation, of which a minute and a half are part of that hour and a half documentary, Beyond Hate, that Moyers and Wiesel made. And I was told when I was up in New York that Mr. Moyers was interested in interviewing me for a series he had going on at that time on PBS. I think he was interviewing great minds. I really loved the idea of being interviewed by Bill Moyers in the way he does. He had a whole series of interviews with Joseph Campbell about the myths. And between the two of them, they produced some wonderful stuff. So anyway, I was very hot to trot. But then I learned about a half year later that, although I had been on the list of people he was looking forward to doing one of those episodes with, that series was being discontinued. I didn't hear the why of it. So I had some standing with Bill Moyers when I heard from John Kerry. I think this was around the turn of the year between 2004 and 2005. So in early 2005, I'm coming up with the idea, maybe I can turn to Bill Moyers so that we can get a powerful, good voice for good American values from this guy from Texas who's made something important out of himself. In the wake of his having been the press secretary to the President of the United States, where we first met him, and he's become this figure, and he's so widely respected, and he has some of the major qualities of one of the great Protestant preachers, but with great intellect as well. A real fusion of good qualities. He could do the job. And so I made a pitch to Moyers. I know that I, again, talked about why there was this need, why he was a guy who could do it, what that might look like, and how completely willing I was to throw myself into the battle, and I didn't have to be paid. If that was the issue, I was just willing to be of any help I could. And then, unlike with Kerry, also, he and I had an exchange of emails. And he is such a gentleman. I think that we might eventually get a portrait of Bill Moyers as a great man. But there was a disappointment there for me in that, I don't know. He's such a gentleman. I didn't know if he was being really nice to me or if he's just such a nice guy. But he was very respectful and very encouraging and appreciative, all the while saying, no, thank you. And what he said about the no thank you was, I'm too old to lead that kind of parade now. I remember the phrase, too old to lead the parade. Essentially, that's what he said. Now, I was, like I said, I was 58, so I looked up how old he was. And he was 71. I thought that was okay. Yeah, that does sound kind of old. Here I am, 78. And I wonder, and he went on to do some other stuff. So I don't really know. But anyway, I was left. I thought, well, who else is there that can play this role that I want? And what what I decided at that point was that I didn't have anybody else. Um, couldn't think of who else would play that role that I would feel like, yeah, about, and be delighted to be of any assistance I could. But more than that, if I could have thought of it, I wouldn't have probably had the means to get myself in front of them. So I decided, well, if this force of fascism that I see threatening us, and I wasn't the only person thinking about what the Bush administration in the first term had shown, that was starting to think about how this aligned with what was known about the nature of fascism. I remember there was a Unitarian minister, I think in Dallas, wrote a really good piece about all the parallels. If that force of fascism has to be presented on the American stage, even though I'm a marginal guy and I can't get to that message to center stage the way John Kerry could have or Bill Moyers could have, I just got to do what I got to do. And so I spent a lot of time setting up to do a website whose purpose would be to do that. Well, I didn't put that into the, but I will be soon reading from. Yeah. Well, anyway, I didn't set this up to show you. So I created a website called See No Evil, or actually, what it's called is None So Blind, because of this Protestant saying, there are none so blind as those who will not see. So its purpose was to show. And one of the subtitles is The Blinding of America. Because I was seeing that people on the conservative side were not seeing what it was they were supporting. And the people on the liberal side were not seeing the force, the dark force that was taking over the right, this force of fascism. So I set up a website, and you can find that website on my current website. It's None So Blind is a portal in my betterhumanstory.org website. None So Blind. Picture of the Statue of Liberty with half of the face light, half the face sort of in dark shadow. And the message at the very beginning is, it makes a fight over everything. It is insatiable in its quest for wealth and power. It appeals to the worst in people, to hatred and fear. It divides groups of Americans against each other. It preys on the vulnerable and serves the privileged. And it lies in virtually all it says. That is a good description, by the way, of the pattern of fascism, but I don't use that word here. The once respectable Republican Party has been hijacked in our times by a sick and broken spirit that damages everything it touches. In this present profound crisis, there is also an opportunity to see and to understand the workings of destructive forces that arise in civilized societies and that must be countered effectively if we, Americans and humankind, are to create a future we want. The purpose of this site is to present a vision of how the human world works and of what we are called to do to make that world more whole. That pretty much summarizes my mission, that I say I'm a man on a mission. But my mission at first was to get that website off the ground. I was starting with nobody. And here I am being ambitious to get America to see what's rising on the right. So the strategy I came up with for launching this thing was to use a platform in which I didn't have a big foothold, but I had shown that I could occasionally have access. And that was a website called Common Dreams. In other words, I wanted to announce the arrival of None So Blind on a place where there already were people who were paying attention to the problems of America, so that I could get some kind of a following. And this, I called it What America Needs Now, a prophetic social movement. There's good reason why millions of Americans remain deeply upset by this recent presidential election. And I don't know how many people remember or knew at the time. I wasn't the only one who was devastated. People forget so much, but there were people who were just so depressed. I mean, people do remember how they felt on November 9th, 2016, when Trump got elected. But the day after the re-election of W, I knew a lot of people who were devastated. Anyway, to continue that piece that I was publishing on Common Dreams, it's not because these ruling forces are so conservative in their values, although they have persuaded half of America that they are righteous champions of such values. Many of the rest of us can see through their pretense. We can see that beneath that sheep's clothing of that false righteousness, they are satisfying the wolf of their unbridled appetite for self-aggrandizement. Fascism is always about strutting. We can see it in their persistent effort to undermine any rules that, in the name of the greater good, would restrain their freedom of action, whether in their tearing down the international order, there I'm referring to the somewhat lawless invasion of Iraq, or in their disrespect for constitutional limits on their power, or in their dismantling of environmental restraints on their pursuit of wealth. We see it too in their use of bullying tactics and character assassination in dealing with political opponents. I think about Max Cleland, the guy who lost 3 limbs in Georgia, whom they equated with Osama bin Laden. For all their pious talk, there is no sign whatever of the golden rule in how they conduct themselves, their politics. We see it in the way they sow enmity, whether between Americans, whom pollsters have found more intensely polarized than ever, or between America and other nations, among whom trust in American power has reached an all-time low. Well, it wasn't all-time for long. I mean, Trump brought it even lower. But it was really low at that time. We were no longer regarded positively among our traditional friends under the Bush presidency. And we see it in their disdain for the truth, whether in how they spin virtually everything they say to us, or how they disregard or distort science, or how they arrange to be told only what they want to hear. I think I'm talking there about how they compelled the head of the CIA to give them a false report about the weapons of mass destruction. I think that's what I had in mind. But this is back in 2005, and maybe I forget. America would be fine in the hands of people devoted to real conservative values, but this is something different, something dangerous. For America is now ruled by forces apparently not guided by any genuine values at all. And this is not just about this particular presidency, which should be understood as the creature of bigger forces. These forces, an alliance of the greediest part of American capitalism with the most powerful, power-hungry, and imperialist of American politicians, and with the most divisive and hypocritical of American religious leaders, have been gathering power for a generation and will doubtless seek to maintain their grip when its current public faces leave office. Never in American history has so much power been in such ruthless hands. After an election campaign that failed utterly to speak about this profound moral danger, in itself a sign of also dangerous moral flaccidity into which American liberalism has declined, we who do see this frightening reality are called upon not to acquiesce and surrender, but to take the struggle for America's soul to a new stage of speaking moral truth to amoral power. Moral truth is their kryptonite. Only by selling their false image of righteousness to good conservative Americans could these forces gain power. But that which depends on moral lies can be defeated with moral truth. For if these good people can be helped to see that these emperors have no moral clothes, they will withdraw their support. By the way, in that belief, I still act on that belief, but it's not nearly as true as I thought in 2005. It's harder than I thought to get these good people in the conservative America to see and to respond on the basis of the values that they say that they hold dear. That's a whole nother subject, what makes that so difficult. But at that time, I thought all you had to do was show it compellingly. Most of those who have supported these rulers should be regarded not as our opponents, but as our potential allies. For the urgent struggle now, again, 2005, is not that of liberal values against conservative values, but of those who really care about goodness against those who only pretend to and care only about power. To accomplish these worthy goals, unmasking the false righteousness of our rulers must be framed in terms of America's shared values, of justice and compassion and truth and fair play, and supported by evidence drawn from our common knowledge. Framed in that way, the stories of what we've all seen can be told in ways that strip away the political coverings and show the dark moral reality about our current ruling forces that lies beneath. America is in need of an emperor's new clothes moment. This emperor has no moral clothing. By skillfully speaking the moral truth, we can help unite the good people of America and end the polarization that our amoral leaders have worked to foster, helping America's conservatives to remember how better to tell the difference between good and evil, and helping America's liberals to remember how absolutely vital and real that difference is. Let us then speak to America out of our faith in a venerable idea deeply embedded in the Western tradition, the Western religious tradition. The idea that the material power of the bad ruler can be overcome by the power of moral truth boldly spoken. Let us launch then a prophetic social movement to reestablish the power of real righteousness in America. When I read that, I realize that's still how I see it. I may have been a little naive and or not fully understood how how strong the grip of the lie was on these good people. Um, that's been it captures what I think has been all the main issues that we face as for fascism has been rising on the political right, misleading people into giving their support, or maybe turning them into their worst selves so that they gladly and knowingly give their support, or some combination of the two. Well, that piece appearing in uh, Common Dreams got me 700 subscribers overnight. So I didn't really have to go through a whole building period. Like, I'm pretty much in a building period here with the same mission about trying to make sure that the forces of wholeness can defeat the forces of brokenness, that the forces of democracy can defeat the forces of fascism, that good can defeat evil is really quite a meaningful way of looking at it. It's the same mission, but on this medium, I don't have the 700. I'm working to build it, but that got me off the ground, and I wrote thousands of articles over the course of this, 6 years, and was read by thousands of people on a regular basis. Wasn't any big public stage thing like Bill Moyers or John Kerry might have been, but it was what I could do. And uh, my life has been a series of, well, you do what you can do. You swing for the fences and then you settle for a single. So long as you don't strike out. And then there came a time when I saw that Barack Obama, who I still have a great fondness for, and I was so excited when he became president. But he wasn't equipped to deal with opponent, a force like he was arrayed against. And I've talked before about how I wrote him an open letter that was published in the Baltimore Sun and called upon him to stop forfeiting the battles he'd been elected to fight. But he wasn't. He was somehow not really capable of dealing with that kind of opposition the way it needed to be dealt with. And so the force that was taking over the right, that ugly thing that I was talking about for years, just got uglier because they got rewarded for behavior that he could have used to punish them by exposing him with a prophetic voice to the American people. That wasn't part of his repertoire. And I saw at the end of 2010 that he wasn't going to be able to do. I wanted the president of the United States to get up there and deliver the message. Oh, and by the way, let me add parenthetically, at some point, I'm thinking I'm going to talk about Gavin Newsom. He's showing some strengths. I don't think he's a hugely wonderful human being. Not all great leaders are hugely wonderful human beings, but he's showing some things that in 2028, I think he's going to be able to parlay into the Democratic nomination for presidency, assuming that we have an election again, which means assuming at the if Biden gets reelected, we will have another election. If Trump does, who knows? Again, I saw, well, if you, Schmuckler, that's me talking to Schmuckler, if you want to hear those things said on the political stage, you're going to have to say it yourself. And I'd never thought of running for political office. My dad had told me when I was 15 why I wasn't cut out for electoral politics. He said, Andy, you insist on saying what you really think, and that's not how politics work. You're going to see me tell that story because I saw that my congressional district was represented by a 10-term Republican incumbent who was a typical Republican who was just, there was no moral integrity there. He wasn't ugly like Matt Gaetz or something like that. But Bob Goodlatte was just a tool of the party line. And I eventually my campaign motto was truth for a change. But before it was truth for a change, let me complete that thought. I saw that he ran unopposed in 2010. So I saw, okay, people understand that in this very, very, very Republican district, no Democratic nominee is going to be able to win that seat. Yeah, but there's a platform there. It's a platform better than the one I was acting from, which is, I occasionally get something published here or there, but, you get attention if you're the nominee of a major political party, even if you're going to be doing well to get, really, really well if you can get 40% of the vote. I got more than a third, but I didn't get the 40. But I got the platform and I made use of it. So in February of 2011, I put my None So Blind website on mothballs so that it wouldn't be there to be mined for enemy research and used against me. And that's what I was advised to do. And I became a candidate, and eventually I became the Democratic nominee. And when I became a candidate, I had a different motto. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. And what that elephant in the room image was trying to do was to say that in America today, there are two problems. The idea of the elephant in the room really means that there are two problems. First, there's the elephant. And then because it's the elephant in the room, it means that other people in the room besides the elephant are failing to talk about what must be talked about. So it was geared towards showing that there's a problem with the Republican Party. It's kind of, I was so excited when I came up with this idea. Oh, the elephant. Yeah, I mean, that's the emblem of the Republican Party. And the elephant in the room is what this Republican Party that was once respectable had become. But what makes it the elephant in the room was that President Obama wasn't talking about the indefensible things that the Republicans were doing, the way a president of the United States should if he's really going to fight the fight that needs to be fought. And when I would deal with liberal America in any of the platforms I had trying to call attention to this rising force of fascism, there was a lack of recognition of the elephant in the room. So that was a critique of both parties. My son-in-law made up that, it was a button that he made for me, a round button. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. I loved it. I think he did a great job. And there were other people who liked it right well, but I came to understand that for a campaign slogan, it's too complex of an idea to be effective when you're running a campaign in a district with 740,000 people or whatever it is that you got to be addressing. So I changed it to Truth for a Change, just to call attention to I'm going to be honest with you, and my opponent really isn't, which I felt able to articulate in any forum that I would get a chance to, being interviewed as the Democratic nominee, et cetera, et cetera. And on the debate stage, too, I thought that I had some success in showing the dishonesty of what Bob Goodlatte had to say. And I gave up also. It wasn't just that it was, that I was asking people to do too much thinking to understand what it was I was trying to say with my slogan. There was also, as a political candidate, I was in a different position um, from the pundit or commentator or interpreter of our times that I had, you know, decades of experience being. Um, uh, that I was a warrior on behalf of the Democratic Party in this case. Um, and though in my, I went around the district, there were like 7 stations of the candidate, from Lynchburg to Roanoke to Lexington to Stanton to Harrisonburg to Front Royal to Luray, things that the press could cover, where I could talk to people for some length of time. But I got it in my head that I'm their champion on the battlefield, and I have to be judicious about calling attention to the failure of my side. To be talking about what needs talking about and to be seeing what needs to be seen that's been taking over the Republican Party. And so by the time Labor Day of 2012 came about, and I'm at the biggest campaign event of of the whole season, a big banquet in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where candidates are going to be able to talk to these 300 plus people gathered at this big banquet. And we speak in order of increasing importance in the pecking order, so that city council people would speak before me as a candidate for the United States Congress. And then I'd be followed by former governor, present Senator Mark Warner, who's going to introduce his buddy, uh, also former governor, and now candidate for senator, Tim Kaine. So I get to introduce the sort of national picture in that pecking order. And I delivered a speech that was largely, let's see, how do I get to it? Oh, okay. It was largely, how do I get down there? Um, okay. I think this is going to work. Here was my opportunity. I was supposed to speak for no more than 5 minutes. I spoke for 6, so that's definitely not not arrogating too much. That's within the limits. Anyway, I spoke to that banquet, and this is the way. And let me say that as I got on a roll, I became a better speaker. It was largely improvised, but it was also building on having for the better part of 2 years been going around the district giving campaign speeches. So here it is.
side. You honor them, you protect them. They're there for a reason. But not this group. They're not conservative. They're not patriotic. We now know that even before President Obama was inaugurated, they met together to say, we're going to make this president fail. And I don't think there's been a single time that an opposition party has made that their priority, but especially at a time of national crisis, when we had 2 wars that they had botched, when we had a healthcare crisis that was bankrupting us from the federal government through the businesses to families, but especially at a time when the whole American economy and the global economy were on the edge of an abyss. You don't want the president to fail if you're a patriot. If the president fails, we only got one of them at a time, the country fails, and tens of millions of Americans suffering. No real patriot would ever want to do that. This Republican Party is a fraud. It is based on lies. You can see that in Ryan's speech last week. You can see it in every utterance. I can see it in the emails I get from Bob Goodlatte. They pretend to be one thing, they are another. The truth is our weapon. Let's go fight that battle and win it.
It was just a stroke of good fortune that speech got videoed. One of the city council people had left his camera running from the speech before me, and he captured this, and then he thought this was something to do something with, and he put it up on YouTube, where it got discovered by the fellow Feld, who was in charge of a website called Blue Virginia, and I'm running for Congress in Virginia, who put it on Daily Kos, a video with his own commentary, which was very positive. And that's the only thing I've ever done that went viral in this world. I think something close to 100,000 people ended up seeing that video. So that was gratifying, and it represented my coming to understand that my job was to inspire people with a battle cry. That's what a candidate's supposed to do. So that's what I tried to do there, and it's still the same picture that we have. I think I'll end my story with that story of discovering and fighting the rising force of fascism from 1990 to the present, from hearing this voice of Rush Limbaugh talking about feminazis and eco-fascism and demonizing, engaged in a fascistic process, which has led us to this ugly point that we're in America right now, where we're engaged in an election where it's possible we could lose our democracy. And it has always been my strong beliefs that it's a systemic problem, that the virus infected the political right, the conservative America, but the liberal side of the equation failed to function as a healthy immune system by not recognizing the virus as a destructive force that needed to be neutralized from the beginning. We need to deal with it systemically also. I think that a lot of progress has been made on the liberal side in terms of now that we see, like Trump doesn't make it at all hidden. I mean, W was somebody you could imagine being sort of a real pious person and a person who believes in that flag that he's wrapping himself around, even though he was heading a presidency which didn't give a whole lot of signs about that sort of thing. But now it's, that same wolf stripped of any sheep's clothing. And we're in a fight for our lives, really, especially for our freedom to live the kind of human life that our founders had in mind when they said that all human beings are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not how fascism works. That's not what Trump represents. So we have a systemic problem. Liberal America has been awakening to it because it's become clearer and clearer. But there's still room for growth on both among the people who have somehow betrayed their own values, but probably without knowing it. But I don't know how many know it and how many don't. And those who don't see the larger forces at work. I hope that if this way of looking at things interests you, I haven't talked about my wider mission, but all of this can be understood in terms of a still bigger picture about a better human story. There is something fundamental about the meaning of what happened to our species as a consequence of our taking an unprecedented step out of the niche in which we evolved biologically by inventing our own way of life on the path of civilization, in other words. That puts a lot of things in a very different light. If we look back at our history and all we see is, civilization's always been here, it has not always been here. It is very recent in terms of the total picture of how did things ever get this way. How things got this way is that we as creatures evolved in a biological system that created an order. After 3.5 billion years, there emerged a creature that had the creative intelligence beyond what any other creature had ever had, that allowed it to take an unprecedented step. And the unprecedented step had unprecedented consequences. That's what that book, I think, shows beyond, for me, any reasonable doubt. And with huge repercussions, I continue to work on understanding how much of what's broken in the world that we see in human history and that we see in the world around us now is a function of the dynamic that's described in that book. And I don't know how much of it wouldn't be there if it weren't for that. But I am convinced that it's been a huge factor. And if we see that, we will understand some things that are very, very differently, that are important to understand. We will see that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. That's because taking that step unleashes a systemic force that isn't a function of the nature of the creature that took that step. And it's inescapable. It's inevitable that it would be unleashed. It's got to do with the disorder that happens inevitably if a creature steps out of the only order that life has. It shows our history has been shaped by a social evolutionary force that is inevitable, that mandates that civilization will develop in certain directions, while other possible options that might be more beautiful are precluded because the only options that can survive and spread are the ones that can prevail in the war of all against all that is the inevitable consequence of that disorder. And it shows that there is operating in the human world from the time we stepped out of that niche and onto the path of civilization, there's been a destructive force at work. And in the years since that book, I've tried to describe how you can see how that force operates in the human world, that you can identify that there are destructive patterns that are getting transmitted over time through cause and effect. And that the fascistic force that we now face in America can completely be, I'd say pretty completely be understood as the outgrowth of the way that force of brokenness operates in the human world. It takes a bit of work to see it, but it can be seen. So there's a big picture here. I call it a better human story. And I claim for that better human story that it's better in two ways. First of all, it's going to feel better because we're going to find out that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. Secondly, it's better in that it gives us a clearer picture of what the nature of the battle is that we're engaged in when it comes to the human future that civilized people have been struggling in for millennia. And a better understanding of the nature of the forces that are embattled, it will give us a better opportunity to fight the fight in a way that's more likely to lead to success, which means that it's more likely to lead to the better outcome. And I claim that it's essentially my gut feeling is it's a toss-up. Whether in the next not so many generations, human civilization will be able to get its act together enough to survive for the long haul on this planet, get it, order our civilization well enough and soon enough, or what seems to me like equally possible, whether we're going to blow it and destroy ourselves through any of the various ways that this force of brokenness is working in the human world still. The fascistic force that insists upon war rather than building peace. The greedy force that's willing to sacrifice the stability of the biosphere in order to gain more short-term wealth rather than finding ways of living in harmony with this planet on which we still depend for our survival. So that's the bigger picture. I always start off talking about more concrete things like, the aid to Ukraine that I started off with, and the Iran-Israel clash, and the things that we can see happening in there that were also good news, and the Trump trial that's just emerging, and my belief that we're gonna see an impact that's favorable in terms of how the American people perceive this guy who is a threat to American democracy. I always try to start with more concrete things in order to, if I can, establish credibility. I've been working hard for a long time to understand things, and then I make big claims like this could have a beneficial impact, this stuff I've put together. Well, who's going to believe that from somebody who, as I say, has mostly been a nobody most of the time? I am trying to establish credibility in case people really would be interested in knowing if the claims were valid. And then I also try to say, if you want democracy to survive and other aspects of the scenarios that we want to have unfold, it would be good to have the understanding of the nature of the battle. I bang my head against, since I first started trying to counter Rush Limbaugh, getting his more and more radio platforms, but never amounting to a whole hell of a lot. But, on various parts of the country I would be on regularly. From that time up until, still, I felt that by virtue of understanding how forces work in the human world, the bigger picture, I was able to perceive what was rising on the right earlier on than the people that I interacted with in liberal America after I set up my website. And even up until the rise of Trump, liberal America was really very, very low on perceiving what was gaining power on the political right, and therefore were ineffectual in making sure that they would be punished politically rather than rewarded politically for indefensible political behavior. So I think that even if all you care about is our ability to win this battle for American democracy, there are good reasons to think it's good to understand the bigger picture. So I hope you'll subscribe to my podcast, where every time I come on, I'm going to do my very best to show this big picture and show some of the nitty-gritty stuff that's connected with it. And I invite you also to go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, where I have laid out a multidimensional, coherent, big picture, integrated view of the story of our species and why it's been the way it has, and what are the nature of the challenges that we, humankind, must meet for this experiment that life has conducted in creating a civilization, creating creature, for that experiment to work out well rather than disastrously. Okay, I think that I'm going to be back here in a short while to do 2 short videos. One on why I feel confident that the whole issue of Michael Cohen's credibility is a non-issue. I feel very confident that the jury's going to see that he's telling the truth, and they're not going to worry about the fact that he's, got this record of having perjured himself. It all makes sense. And then I'm going to say something, I think, if my voice holds out. By the way, did you notice I had a better voice in 2012 when I gave that speech? Well, that's another story. I'm going to talk about Gavin Newsom. I think we may have our next presidential candidate for 4 years from now. And I say that because he's impressed me even while I'm not in love with him. But I think he's got a couple of qualities that are what we should be looking for. They certainly would do us well in the present situation, and I doubt we'll be out of the woods fully by 2028. So anyway, I'll talk about that. So if you're interested, stand by. I'll be back. Thank you. Bye-bye.